Glad to be here.
So great to have you on board. Look, let's start somewhere for anyone who might not be completely familiar with Stacks. So as I understand it, I think it's a really cool idea, smart contracts and dApps for Bitcoin. But Muneeb, maybe you could give us a really quick rundown on what Stacks is and why it is so different to, say, other blockchain networks. Oh, have we just lost you, Muneeb?
I'm here. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, you're here. Oh, great. Yep.
All right.
Excellent.
Awesome. So yeah, as you said, I think Stacks is smart contracts for Bitcoin. But I think what it makes it really unique is, as many of you know, that Bitcoin is a blockchain that is very hard to change. So you can't really kind of like modify Bitcoin or introduce new features to that. But at the same time, Bitcoin has $1 trillion of crypto capital in Bitcoin as sound money that people would love to use in smart contracts and so on. So that's the problem that we've been working on, that how do you bring new functionality to Bitcoin without modifying Bitcoin? So in some ways, building a separate blockchain system is easier in certain ways, right? Because you have full control, you're designing a new system from scratch, you can program it however you want. But in our case, Stacks is a layer 1 blockchain with its own gas asset. So just like, with Ethereum, you use ETH to in smart contracts, and you use Stacks in Clarity smart contracts. So Clarity is a different language. I'll get into it later. But the unique thing here is that the Stacks blockchain connects to Bitcoin, and it has a native connection, and there's consensus between the two blockchains. So instead of having consensus within a single blockchain, you actually have consensus between two blockchains. And Stacks has full visibility into Bitcoin. So if there are state changes on the Bitcoin side, they automatically get picked up by Stacks, and developers can actually start programming against that logic. And that's super interesting, because that's the way to bring smart contracts to Bitcoin without actually modifying it.
Yeah, it is a really interesting idea. And I love what you've said before too about how, Bitcoin is widely recognized as a store of value. Just don't call it a shining rock. It's not digital gold. It was, widely recognized as that. I love that quote from Melton recently. But, you're looking at ways that you can kind of better deploy this passive capital, this sovereign money that's, otherwise tied up and, not being used as efficiently as possible, which is a really great, a really fantastic idea. But I guess the other thing too that Stacks is really known for is, I love how you said you've always done things really differently to other projects. And absolutely your regulatory journey is one of those that has been very different to other projects. And we won't cover that for too long, but I did just want to touch it because you've had some really big news over the past couple of weeks. So for anyone who isn't familiar, Hiro, it is now known as Hiro, but formerly Blockstack, made history in 2019. It was the very first SEC qualified ICO, successfully raised 23 million in that particular raise. Congratulations. But now you've just filed an annual report with the SEC, which you intend to be your last. And that means that Stacks could be the very first registered crypto network security to transition to a decentralized utility token. And I know that this was always on your roadmap. This was always the goal. So, can you talk a little bit to the road to decentralization? What were the key milestones and indicators that have allowed you to get to this stage now where you're really looking at the ecosystem as being fully decentralized? And how did community play a role in that?
Yes, I think that's a great question. I would say in general, like we've always had that value of like doing the hard things upfront, right? So instead of like, for example, let's say on the technical side, that instead of like pushing the hard problems down the road, like why don't we try to solve them upfront? Because then we will benefit from that down the road, right? So I think that has always been kind of like the ethos of the project. So when it comes to regulations and compliance, we kind of like took the similar approach. I think it was the harder thing to do in many ways, to try and figure out, how does the US regulations work, like try to actually get qualified by the SEC, do all of the reporting and coming up with kind of like the legal frameworks, the financial audits and so on. Like that's actually like pretty hard. And nobody else had done it before, but I think in general, instead of basically treating these things as gray areas and saying that, hey, we don't really know how the regulations work here. We took the challenges like upfront, in the sense that if you're trying to do an offering, let's try to figure out what a compliant offering would look like. And then similarly, the underlying asset is the same, right? It's a gas token that is used in smart contracts. But depending on the Howey test analysis, the regulators might look at it and say that, hey, this thing is a security because there's a company that is doing an offering and people are kind of like depending on that company. But then over time, we have kind of like built out the public infrastructure. We have done the R&D that is needed to launch the network. And then independent miners came in and they launched the network. And we were very explicit about decentralization as well. We have Jenny here from the Stacks Foundation, which is a completely independent, separate entity. There's no overlap in board or management or anything like that. And that's not the only entity. There are like so many other players in our ecosystem, like Freehold, Damon, Secret Key Labs, New Internet Labs, and so on and so forth. Some of them are started by early project members, but these are really kind of like explicitly independent players. And we took the path of like having very open dialogue with the community as well, like in the sense that the SEC filings helped kind of like reduce information asymmetry between the general public and the people who are project insiders, because everyone can go and look at the public filings and they know all the details about the directors and officers and their salaries or their incentive plans or who owns how many stacks and so on. So there's a lot of transparency, which is actually a good thing, a healthy thing from a decentralization perspective, from a perspective of building a healthy community. And then we've been very open with our community in terms of the plans for increased decentralization. So our company, as you mentioned, that we did the early R&D and building the public infrastructure, but we were very open about that once this network launches, we'll be focusing on more narrowly on just developer tools. And you can't expect like Hiro to be the entity that's kind of like doing, or the only entity that is trying to basically do the work on the blockchain and so on, right? So we, instead of decentralization being this implicit thing that happens to one degree or the other, we try to make it very explicit with a decentralization legal framework, that here's a legal framework through which there's no single entity that kind of like controls this network now.
Yeah, you really have laid a lot of groundwork there, which I think a lot of people could thank you for in the future. You've also said that it could be potentially a model for other startups to follow in future. And I was wondering, now that you can look with the benefit of hindsight, you've got that model. Obviously, I think you would have had to sacrifice a lot to go down that path. Do you really think it was worth it to lay that legal groundwork and push ahead in the way that you did?
So I think like this is something, for example, the sentiment in the industry, for example, in something like 2019 or so, when we got the SEC qualification, might have been that these people are crazy. Why do you need to go through all that trouble? The SEC is just going to give people a slap on the wrist, and everyone is just going to get away with all the different type of offerings that they've done. But I think that has clearly not been the case. Now with the Telegram enforcement, with the Ripple lawsuit, with the Kick enforcement that actually went to the court and the court sided with the SEC, now it's like very clear in the industry that no, these things have very real consequences, and you need to look into how you're complying. So I think we're very glad that we were very thoughtful from the beginning, instead of being kind of like being in more trouble down the road and taking more risk on the regulation side. And I think the other thing here would be that yes, it was a lot of overhead, both from a legal and kind of like compliance perspective, but also in terms of like mental bandwidth as well. Like I'm a computer scientist. We're engineers. We're here to kind of like build these, build this platform and enable apps and smart contracts on Bitcoin. And regulation is kind of like a necessary thing that's happening on the side, and you don't want that to be too much overhead. I think we were in a fortunate position that we had raised capital from VCs even before that, so we could actually we had more resources to be able to do these things. I think if you're a smaller startup, like some of just the overhead, just the cost overhead of doing some of these things might be prohibitive for you. So over time, I would love to see like frameworks that are cheaper, that are easier, and there's more clarity for people to do a compliant offering for whatever that they're trying to raise capital for. And then I do think that the latest work that we have done, where there's a framework for how something that might look like a security in the beginning can reach a point where it's decentralized enough that it is very clearly not a security. I actually think that that framework might end up being the more valuable thing for the industry, because, for example, we've seen proposals for safe harbors, even from Hester peers at the SEC. But the safe harbor proposals, they have this big question mark that, sure, you have a safe harbor, but how would somebody exit the safe harbor and not be a security anymore? So I think our framework actually directly kind of like fits that. And I do think like we are already seeing some adoption in the industry where people are encouraged by that, and they're basically are inspired by that type of framework, and they're trying to fit that into different models.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I do think that your commitment to transparency really does align with the broader interests of this industry in terms of decentralization. But I think that hard work and that commitment up front to lay down that framework is paying off, because I think, some would argue too that the meteoric price rise of Bitcoin in the last few months has been largely driven by things like regulatory clarity, bringing institutional interest. So I think that's actually really interesting as the industry continues to mature, and people will be looking more to organizations like yours that have taken a different approach. So we are definitely seeing a change in attitude. I completely agree with you there. But Jenny, I wanted to throw to you. So we've chatted all crypto regs. Now I'm really interested to know a little bit about the dev community, because I know that that's a big goal, and you've also launched some very interesting initiatives that you could maybe tell us a bit about. Tell me, what does the dev community look like right now? How many devs? Where are they? What are they working on?
Sure. Okay, so yeah, I think what I can start with is just talking a little bit about what the foundation does specifically to support those efforts. So at the foundation, we see our main role as empowering and supporting those who want to build a user-owned internet by way of stacks. And I think taking on that role has been really interesting in developing our relationship to our developer community that has been so core to what we've been doing for the past however many years. So the kinds of devs that we have in the community really range. We've got devs who joined us because they really believed in our mission for user ownership and data ownership and privacy. So we've got some people who are really principled and have been building from the very start when we were focusing on decentralized identity. And now, after mainnet especially, we're seeing an influx of developers who are interested in leveraging things like our stacking mechanism to bring new business models to things like NFTs and that whole world of DeFi. So as far as like what we're seeing, it's definitely a range, and the way that we're choosing to support our devs, we take a couple of approaches. So we have at the foundation, we've got our Stacks Grants program, which serves as sort of this first layer of support for builders, both technical and non-technical, but it really gives them a community and an infrastructure to cultivate their projects for the broader Stacks community. And then on top of that, we recently launched the Stacks Accelerator, which I'm sure you've seen a little bit of news on. And that really provides a path forward for founders and entrepreneurs as well. And I think the thing that sticks out about the Accelerator, what we're really excited about, is just the mix of experience and expertise we're offering to developers in the Stacks community to take their projects to the next level. I think it was important for us to strike a balance between big names in the traditional accelerator space, as well as thought leaders in crypto, to really cater to those nuanced challenges of building a crypto, of which there are many. So those are some of the ways that we're supporting our devs. Our dev community is definitely growing. We're seeing this through the Stacks chapters program. So we recently introduced a few chapters. These are basically community leaders who are working on the ground to spread Stacks to other places in the world, which we definitely couldn't do without them. So shout out to our community leaders. But we're seeing an influx of interest from Stacks Pakistan, for example. They've recently launched a Clarity developer program, recently had a hackathon, and bringing smart contracts on Bitcoin to that part of the world. So lots of efforts to reach developers, but it's definitely a community-wide effort, working with our community leaders, working with our accelerator, working with our grants program to try to reach as many people as possible.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We've only got 2 minutes left, I think, but I was interested to understand like how that has changed, because I know sort of a year ago, a lot of your devs were working on things like decentralized versions of Google and Facebook and LinkedIn so that people can have true data ownership. But with the rise of things like NFTs and DeFi, are you seeing different kinds of innovation evolving now throughout the community?
Yes, so that's exciting, and I would say that those devs who are working on those projects are still very much active in the community. And I think the exciting thing is seeing us. Well, it's a collective effort, understanding how ownership underlies like sustainable models for NFTs and sustainable models for DeFi. So as far as like applications we've seen in the accelerator program, I'm seeing teams who really want to address NFTs in a different way. So mentioned using stacking, that mechanism as a way to bring new business models to things like NFTs. So you're looking at NFTs that produce a yield or generate a yield for users. That's super interesting, very innovative, and ultimately supports NFTs on Bitcoin. And we're also seeing teams that are laying the foundation for sustainable DeFi on stacks as well. So we're starting to see the early rumblings of like lending and borrowing platforms, but also teams that respect user ownership and data ownership. So the merging of those two worlds has been great to see. I think it's been really reassuring to see that emergence of interest, because it assures us that we're doing something right, and that these teams that could have built elsewhere see the Stacks approach as adding value to what they're building.
Well, congratulations to you both. I think it's a really inspiring project. I'm looking forward to following everything that you do over the coming months and years. And if anyone's interested in the Stacks Foundation Accelerator Program, applications close soon, so hurry up and get in. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much.